Would you consider yourself a poet?
As long as you're not asking the question viewing that as a compliment, I would say yes. But I would just, a really heavy disclaimer, I don't view that as complimenting myself. I'm just answering the question as best I can factually, how I view what I do. The answer would be yes, but it's just funny for people who have to battle for their survival. It's still kind of considered a compliment to call somebody a poet, right? Think of the expression poetry in motion. I see like athletes want to call themselves artists, right? So there is a strong sense in which a word like artist or poet or philosopher, etc., they're viewed as compliments, but it's not in any way reflected in the status they're actually given in society or any kind of material reward, for sure.
Right.
They're still viewed as compliments, and I never want to compliment myself.
Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. Today I have author Sergio De La Pava. Sergio is the author of A Naked Singularity and Lost Empress. He's also a lawyer. That's right, he's a public defender in New York City. So not only is he a killer writer, but he's doing all of the important work that needs to be done to make things right, to keep society on an even keel. I've just finished my taping with him, and honestly, the thing that comes through is altruism mixed with creative. He is not only creative, but he's altruistic. And I recommend visiting all the links in the description to get a sense of his output of work, and also purchase his books. Like, his books are really, really good. They're really well written. If you're a fan of the written word, if you're a fan of the sentence, Sergio's got his game on. Anyway, I'll see you guys on the other side. Thanks. I'd love to talk to you about your writing, about your publishing. If it's okay with you, I'd also like to, are you still a public defender?
I am.
I'd love to talk about that too, if that's okay.
Of course.
I've been consuming a lot of the YouTube content that you're in, just to prepare for this. And there was a radio show you called into that I have to talk about, because I didn't feel like, I felt like the host wasn't very nice, or at least the host had an angle that he was going for, regardless of what you were saying to him. And I don't remember the name of the show, but I'll link to it just for the sake of having an intact discourse. But he's like, oh, de Blasio says that it was his policy that resulted in the spike in crimes. And you were trying to convey to him that you have to look at statistics and context and try to understand them over the long term. And there was a refusal to accept that. And first off, I think you're the first person on here that seems to understand how to deal with statistics.
Right. So, well, so what you're referring to is an interview I did over late summer, maybe, in Chicago, centered around my other career, meaning not novelist. I'm the legal director of a public defender office in Manhattan. So we get occasional, probably more than ever, there seems to be significant interest in our criminal justice system and what we call mass incarceration. So I knew going in, this was what you might call a far right radio program.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people in our position maybe would take that to mean like, that's not somebody you get on the air with. I kind of view it the other way. I meet a lot of people every day who it's like preaching to the choir. They know what mass incarceration is. They agree with my positions on it. And I enjoy talking to them, but there's really no kind of public service element to it. We all agree on what we think is wrong and what needs to be fixed. So I viewed that as an opportunity to maybe start making some inroads to other people who view crime and punishment in what we call it kind of an old-fashioned way, which is like the only way you're getting swept up in the criminal justice system of this country is if you do something significantly wrong. And then so as a result, you kind of have yourself to blame for being in the position you're in. But that kind of ignores the fact that, if you and I were having this conversation in like 1970, 1992, to just pick a random date, there would be about 250,000 people incarcerated in the country. And yet today there's over 2 million. So it's like a 700% increase in the last half century in terms of the percentage of people that we meaning the United States of America, incarcerate. So something's gone wrong there. And so, when, there were some significant reforms enacted January 1st of 2020 in New York that were designed to reduce our bail population. And they worked in the sense that our jail population is less than it was then. But then what you had is some people who can, have some pretty significant effect on public opinion, kind of blasting, examples, at least as they would put it, of where these reforms resulted in, dangers to public safety. And it was, not based on fact, based on passion, based on many instances, racism and other kind of anti-intellectual activity. So I welcome any kind of debate that deals with data. You were talking about data. I always say in my position as legal director, I'll talk to you if we're going to have a fact-based, data-based discussion about what's wrong with our criminal justice system and how it can be fixed. Let's have at it. But if you're just going to kind of put on blast the stereotypical Willie Horton type stuff that's been working since 1988, that to me is not an intellectual conversation. And I'll still have it with you, but let's recognize what we're doing here. Yeah. So in that case, one of the narratives that emerged was, well, look at New York. They enacted these reforms, and now look, their crime rate has gone up. A really simplistic kind of analysis that didn't in any way take into account, like, oh, there's this little thing you might have noticed that happened around March that really increased poverty nationwide, and where New York City was kind of the first place really viciously affected by this whole thing. Again, if we want to sit and have a debate that includes facts and truth and intellectual reasoning, let's do that. But let's not pretend that's what we're doing, and you're just kind of regurgitating what I call the Willie Horton stuff.
Do you think that that's why a lot of people will be hesitant to call into these shows? Because it's not going to be that?
When I got the invitation, I didn't really know much about the show, and I got to say, I felt fairly treated during the interview. I didn't feel that anything was wrong. The person listened, and in fact, I think that interview was a sign of how far we've come. Believe it or not, it used to be absolutely no attention paid to the people who were incarcerated all the time. No interrogation about whether we might not be doing things correctly. You can look back through the archives and look at, like, before 2010, how many people were using the phrase mass incarceration? Half a dozen people, right? So yeah, it's a slow, arduous grind, but we have reached a place where at least a majority of people in power are interrogating a lot of these notions about what it means to be tough on crime, or what a war on drugs is, or, mandatory minimums. A lot of these things are in the air, at least. So yeah, it's been gratifying in that sense.
Let's segue over to your writing for a bit. I promise we'll circle back to this, because I initially reached out to you to talk about your writing, and then in my research, my notes for all the criminal justice stuff ended up becoming more dominant. But I'm interested in a few things: the mechanics of your process, also your reasoning for self-publishing initially. From what I understand, A Naked Singularity was self-published, and in my MFA, self-publishing was always looked down on. I was like the only person in the program that advocated for it, mostly because I always felt like self-publishing implied a sense of urgency. There's an urgency, I have to get this out there, and the process is too slow for what I have to put out there. And I don't know if you feel that same way, but what was your decision for doing this? Why?
So a lot of it was driven by necessity. Now that's an interesting element to bring up. It certainly wasn't required to self-publish it. I could have kept the manuscript in some drawer and never thought about it again. So that's not, I don't mean necessity in that way. I mean that I attempted to go the traditional route when I had the manuscript of A Naked Singularity, and that's a long time ago. Probably we self-published in 2008. So we're talking about like 2006, 2005, whatever the publishing world and landscape was then. Attempted to go the conventional route, attempted to get the conventional route for those who don't know. And I suspect a large portion of people who listen to our podcast do know this, but those who aren't aware with publishing, the almost overwhelmingly common way you proceed is you try to get an agent first. You try to get an agent. You're actually not really pitching to publishers directly for the most part. You're trying to get an agent who would do that for you. And I just like struck out for you. When I mean like as bad as you can strike out, like no agent. Many agents would say, this is great. This is mind bending. I love this. And then followed by, but I want no part of it. So, a couple of years of that. And I am not the most patient person, not the most, I'm quick to anger and quick to, especially back then when I was a lot younger. And so I just said, I just will not engage in this process anymore. At which point, my wife, Susanna De La Pava, who's an attorney who really does keep up with publishing even back then, thought there was this route, basically went down that route, self-published the book in 2008, and then began kind of garnering or attempting to garner a lot of reviews for it, which is almost impossible to get a self-published book review back in 2008, which is when it was. But she managed to get, a kind of critical mass form of reviews saying, yeah, this is a worthwhile book, enough to the point where the University of Chicago got interested. And then it's been pretty much the conventional route since then. So it was when I say necessity, I mean, it wasn't like I turned down traditional publishing contract offers and said, no, I have to self-publish this. That would have been cool. And I might have done that. I don't know, but that never materialized until the book already existed and the University of Chicago said, hey, we want to republish this. And at that point I did step in and my petulance insisted that it be a word for word reprint, literally. So I could kind of, as an attorney also, maybe make the record clear. This is what nobody wanted any part of, word for word. So yeah, like I said, I'm not as petulant as I was in my early 30s, but it's still there.
You're originally from Colombia?
I was born in the U.S., but I was born to parents who immigrated from Colombia.
How long have you been here?
Well, I was
A
born
long
in
time?
my whole life, yeah.
Oh yeah, the whole life. Okay. Um, what what does your writing process look like? Do you tend to go into some sort of flow and just do it, or do you? I had an author on here who spends hours on single sentences and takes years, 20 years to write write anything publishable. Uh, what does your process look like?
I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle of that. I can't claim any kind of ownership to any flow. Maybe once in a while, if you know where something's going, and then it's just a question of executing the directions to get to that point. That's probably when I find I experience something like what you're probably talking about when you say flow. I'm very jealous of those people I hear, I can knock out a novel in 6 months. I cannot. It's more like a slowly gestating process. Now, when I get to a certain point, yes, then it's a lovely feeling. And you can look up and 3 weeks later, you've written what would seem to be 70% of the book when you actually do the tallying. But a lot of time is spent. I have a lot more in common with the person you're describing who can spend, 8 hours taking out a semicolon, then putting it back in. So I definitely have it. I definitely know what that feels like. I'm not sure I know what the polar opposite of that feels like, except for very minor spurts.
Hmm. Um, do you ever think about? Have you ever had thought at all about what you would do in a situation where, let's say, you had a defendant who is revealed to you the location. I know this is going to sound like an amateur question, but I am interested in sort of conscience. Let's say a defendant revealed to you the location of millions of dollars in stolen cash, and only you and him know it. He's locked up. She, anybody, that person is locked up. Have you ever thought about what you would do?
I thought about it for about the 6 years it took me to write Naked Singularity. Let's put it that way. Um, you know, that little moment was really the genesis of the book, of thinking about that, how we define ourselves, what we're capable of, what we're not capable of, what that would mean. In many ways was the impetus for writing my first novel. So yeah, I spent years thinking about it. It's never actually transpired. I can't imagine it ever would. But it is a fun kind of exercise that can jolt you into all sorts of fun avenues, and it did there in that case.
What'd you come to?
I don't think I would do what the main character of my novel does. I'm very kind of, at times, oddly enough, kind of very rule followy and very, um, I don't know. I just think that that's a line I'm unlikely personally to ever even straddle, let alone cross.
Yeah, yeah, I was thinking that's probably be your answer because of not so much the book, but because of the fact that you're a public defender. I think there's an altruism to that. And have you ever?
I'm a big fan of the rules. I'm just a bigger fan of the people who break the rules and who I then represent. But I do like rules. I mean, it's weird. I can't help it. That's just kind of my nature. I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I've always been fascinated by the law. I'm not a fan of being judgmental
Yeah.
of others. But personally, I mean, like most writers, I just want to read and write and be home. And like, I'm not some kind of rebel out there, like engaging in wrongdoing. In general, I'm mostly just happy if I have a book or I'm writing.
Have you ever turned down an offer to work at a big, well-paying law firm?
I think when I was in law school, the public defender route was certainly much looked down upon. Um, you're kind of dooming, and it's still true, you're dooming yourself to a certain kind of poverty. Let's not exaggerate. We know what real poverty is. I'm not talking about that. But you have a law degree and probably cost quite a bit of money to acquire that law degree. Law degrees today go for over $200,000, which means you're nowadays, most people putting themselves in that kind of debt to become lawyers. So certainly back then, when you started advertising that what you wanted to do was be a public defender, I mean, that was viewed as kind of a ludicrous decision. Less so today, and that's attributable to what we discussed at the outset, which is the kind of societal shift. Public defenders are more respected today than ever. They're viewed as kind of this vanguard trying to change this intractable civil rights mass atrocity that's been going on.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case in the 90s. So I'll say that I've never been tempted to use my law degree any differently than I've used it for this whole time, which is, to represent human beings. That's the most thrilling part of it. But also, since it's nowadays kind of a merger between representing people who've gotten themselves in a bit of a jam, but at the same time advocating for large scale reforms that are much needed. So no, I've never genuinely viewed any other job with a law degree kind of with any interest, really.
You're the second public defender I've had on this podcast in just a 2-week period, and which is interesting. I wouldn't have predicted that when I started this thing last year, but there was a topic that I had talked about with this woman. She's a public defender in the state of New Mexico, that you also kind of brought up in the Animal Riot podcast when you did their podcast, and it was the whataboutism, where we're talking about, I think in regards to the closing of Rikers Island, and you had talked about people and I had also talked about this with this other woman. You say to somebody, well, we should lower the amount of incarcerated people for the good of society, and then they come back at you, well, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? Have you thought how you would more about how you might respond to these sort of what about sort of people who are bet it's kind of a conservative view of law enforcement where, well, we need to have a brutal system just to pad it against all of these brutal criminals or whatever. I can never seem to come up with a response.
Well, as someone who's intimately aware of what exactly composes our incarcerated population, I really don't have to engage in hypotheticals where, for example, advocating for a world where murder would be legal or punishable by things like community service. I don't have to do that because the 700% increase that I spoke about in our incarceration rate, that's not driven by murderers and rapists. Okay, let's be honest. It just isn't. If it is, that's even more. What is wrong with our society? Do we have 700% more violent people than we did in 1973? What happened was an expansion of what merits incarceration to include nonviolent drug offenders, nonviolent property crimes, things of that nature is what drove and continues to drive this toxic increase in our incarceration rate. Our incarceration rate leads the world. So either we just happen to have the most lawless society on the globe, in which case that probably bears some investigation. Why is that? Or we're just addicted to this process as a kind of panacea that doesn't involve any kind of intellectual examination of anything. Just lock them up. Somebody committed a crime, but the kind of default result is to incarcerate them. That's the way you increase incarceration rate, by adopting that kind of attitude. If you're waiting for there to be more violent people than there were, well, you've lost, because all data shows that violent crime in this country is currently dropping and has dropped for decades at an amazing clip. There's a lot less violent crime today than there was in 1985, but there's a lot more people incarcerated. So let's just stick to that. Let's draw the conclusions. I get it. There's some interesting intellectual debates to be had for people who don't believe in any incarceration. If somebody doesn't believe in incarceration for any reason whatsoever, then that's a conversation you can have. What will you do with somebody who engages in violence? What do you do with someone who shoots someone else in the head if you don't believe in incarceration at all? That to me that's like a 2 a.m. college campus question. We have an urgent question in front of us right now that needs to be answered, which is, why are we incarcerating 7 times the number of people that they incarcerate in Germany? That's the question that needs to be answered, not what would a complete outlawing of any incarceration look like. That we know that's not going to happen. Let's stay focused on what we can do now to make our society more just in this area.
Well, in writing, I always went with this idea that behavior is everything. So your character could say and profess that they are this, but their behavior says what the truth is. And I've always thought that we say that we believe in freedom and fairness and law, but our behavior as a society doesn't really indicate that. And case in point is the lack of funding for public defenders.
Absolutely. I mean, we're relatively fortunate in New York City to have well-funded public defender offices, but I travel across the country. I use the past tense there. Nobody's traveling anywhere now, but I travel across the country. I visit other public defender offices. I hear horror stories of public defenders with 350 clients and no social workers on staff, no investigators on staff. It's an outrage. It's an outrage. Yeah. Part of the problem is we incarcerate too many people, and related to that, it's too easy to incarcerate people. The resources of your police departments, especially here in New York, the resources of the prosecutor's offices, orders of magnitude greater than public defender's offices. Right? They're supposed to be countervailing forces. They're supposed to, these are the people we entrust, meaning public defenders, and we entrust to make sure that the Constitution is being followed, that our rules are being followed, that are, and then you give them no tools to do that by, or very minimal tools to do that by. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Do you know, we might be overstepping expertise, but do you know whether or not the federal government has the jurisdiction to mandate states and municipals governments allocate adequate funding, and to determine what adequate funding actually means for each city?
Public defender offices throughout our country are either offices of the state government or they're funded by the state government. And for example, in New York, no public defender office receives any federal funding. Federal public defender offices are funded by the federal government, meaning if somebody is arrested and charged with a federal crime, for which they will answer in federal court, and they cannot afford an attorney, they will be assigned a federal public defender. And what a surprise, federal public defender offices are far better funded than state public defender offices as a general rule. So that's part of what we're talking about. But generally, the feds stay out of the state system. And mass incarceration, by the way, mass incarceration is a state-sponsored atrocity. You know what I mean? The vast majority of people incarcerated in our country are not incarcerated in the federal system. They're incarcerated in local jails, county jails, state prisons. That's where they're incarcerated. This is a state problem, and that adds to the challenge because there's 50 different states with 50 different rules, 50 different ways of funding public defender offices. It's not an easily soluble problem. And a big part of the problem is that variety from state to state. So as I said, in New York, if we're being honest, we have it pretty good when compared to Louisiana, Tennessee, et cetera. I can go down the list.
What state do you think is doing the best in terms of turning this around?
My guess is New York, but that could be just a local bias. That's where I've worked all my time. I mean, we have made some great strides in New York. It's been like pulling teeth, but I mean, I know the people who've done this work, and they're remarkably talented. They're remarkably driven, and we are seeing some success. I'm never satisfied. I'll never be satisfied. I don't follow other states as closely, so I couldn't tell you. But I mean, without being satisfied, which is just a state of mind that I don't think I will ever achieve. Yeah. There's work to do. There's still a lot of work to do.
I like that pulling teeth, because I feel like anything in New York is like pulling teeth. Going to lunch in New York is like pulling teeth. But when I first moved here, I recognized right away that, this to me is the greatest city in the world except for Rikers Island. I recognized right away that was going to be the scar I was always going to be reading about.
Yep.
All right. You're working on a project now? Should we expect something from you?
I'm hoping, right, knock on wood, to finish up a novel relatively soon. Yeah.
Good. Is your work as a public defender currently going on during the pandemic?
Yeah. So in New York City, my office is in Manhattan. 99% of court stuff is being done virtually. Not ideal, but that's been true now when I sit down and do the math and realize that it's been since March of last year that we've been mostly operating virtual. And I was in court about a week ago in person. It was thrilling to see other human beings and do the job the way it used to be done. But for the most part, yes, we're operating. Yes, it's virtual. No, it's not in any way a situation that's really attractive or positive. It's about doing the bare minimum right now, trying to get as many people out of jail, out of Rikers Island as we can. And because that's especially now, an extremely dangerous place. You're talking about people who can't social distance. You're at Rikers Island, you're a prisoner, you're not a free agent to do what you wish. And not surprisingly, the rate of infection in incarcerated facilities and prisons and jails throughout the country is far higher than it is in the general population. So that's been our focus pretty much since March of last year. And yeah, every day, you know, working from home, but working.
Are the courts? I'm interested in the sort of the personality of the courts, and I know this is a hard one, but would you say that they're in line with what you're trying to do, with the mission?
I would
Or
say they're more in line today than they were, uh, 5, 10 years ago. But it's an adversarial system.
yeah,
Um, when I say we're trying to get people off of Rikers Island because of COVID, don't don't mix it up. There's a prosecutor arguing to keep the person in Rikers Island. Invariably, 99 times out of 100, there's a prosecutor, and there's a judge saying, "I agree with the prosecutor." Not quite 99 out of 100 times, but the clear majority of the time. So, to the extent we've managed to win over the hearts and minds of the average citizen, don't kid yourself. There's still a prosecutor arguing against everything we try to do. At least this is true in Manhattan. I'm not claiming I know what other jurisdictions are like. Certainly in Manhattan, there's still a prosecutor arguing against whatever you're trying to do. And there's still a judge generally that you have to convince.
yeah,
Is it better than it was? Yeah, but don't kid yourself. There's not, people walking off of Rikers Island because of concerns over their health, in massive busloads. Similarly, when we, undertook a concerted effort, during at the height of the pandemic to get the governor of this state, New York, to release people or to grant clemency to nonviolent offenders who are particularly at risk. For the most part, those efforts went nowhere. They did not succeed at any kind of significant rate. So society has progressed, but I think those actual players in our criminal justice system who aren't public defenders, right, who aren't community activists, that population has not kept up.
what do you think? There's a difference in? I'm thinking now about the qualification factor. The people who are brought in to be a prosecutor, to work in the prosecution office, versus the people who gravitate towards being the public defenders. And have you found that there's a difference in personality? There's a difference in sort of their outlook on the whole bigger picture of society and people in general? Or
Anything I say about that would basically be self-serving. I mean, there are a lot of high character people in DA's offices. There's a lot of high character people on the bench. If you ask me to identify a general trait, I would say that what distinguishes public defenders from them is maybe a deeper level of intellectual curiosity and thinking about these things. Being overly judgmental is, in my opinion, is an intellectual failure.
yeah,
It's a failure of empathy, not being able to see the person in a three-dimensional way. And this does kind of tie into novel writing or the creation of art. Being overly judgmental is a way of denying the three-dimensionality of the person that you're judging. And well, in my experience, as I said, a lot of high character, a lot of talented people on the bench and at DA's office, there's no question about that. But if I had to point to a deficit, it would be in that area.
yeah. Interesting. How do you find how do you compartment between working on your client cases and your writing? Are you taking lunches to take down ideas? Or are you taking them down as they come? Or are you like really compartmenting them? I do not write when I'm in Manhattan or something like that.
If I,
I'm interested
I
in,
mean,
in the mental
what your
jumble.
question brings up is, what does it mean to say, I am writing now
Yeah.
and I am not writing now? And what I find is, if I'm awake and I'm not engaged in like a really hyper hypersensory task like writing a legal brief or appearing in court for a client or interviewing a witness or interviewing a client, unless I'm engaged in something like that, that just by necessity takes all your attention, then I'm writing. It may not look like what writing looks like in a Hollywood movie. You're not hearing clacking on a typewriter. It may look like me just staring out the window, or it may just look like me jotting down a note, which is better than staring out the window, or writing in a sentence, which is better than jotting down a note. But it's all a form of writing. And what I realized when I first really directly turned my attention to say, okay, the goal here is to produce a novel of this length that does X, Y, Z. When I first started doing that, was realizing that, oh, I've just been writing all my life. It's just that now I'm actually making a very significant decision to, at the end of this, have a physical object that you can look at. But what I realized is I've been writing since I was 6, 7 years old. This is what I do. I invent dialogue for people. I invent situations. I kind of look things from different angles. I invent plots. I do this all the time, whether I want to be doing it or not. When I say all the time, again, I'm leaving out the one exception I've identified where I'm engaged right there on something immediate. So no, I don't say I'm going to sit down and the next 8 hours is writing, or these 8 hours will not be writing because I'm doing this. It's a much more organic, much natural, much more of a natural process than that. I hope that makes sense. I don't know.
No, that's in line with.
I read a lot of interviews of writers, and they say 6 a.m, I'll be at my typewriter. 3 o'clock, I'll stop. I'll make my drink. I'll have dinner with my wife. That's great. I've never been able to. Never had the luxury. I don't even know if I call it luxury because I'm not sure I would enjoy it. Of doing that. Never done that way. Never viewed writing that way. Maybe I should. Maybe that's a failure on my part. I will say this. I used to kind of look longingly when I would read that in an interview and say, well, I wonder what that would be like to do that. Well, this pandemic the last year has kind of forcefully created something like that situation. I don't wake up every morning and put on a suit and tie and drive 2 hours each way, or 1 hour each way to get to work. I don't do that for the most part for the last 10 months. And what did I find? Well, I found that my productivity with respect to writing is pretty much what it was before. There's no direct correlation, because it's a much more amorphous process than that. It's not like, well, look how much more time you've been able to devote to your writing. Well, not true, because my other job in many ways has become even more difficult. It's become even more all-encompassing. And second of all, I just realized that that's not who I am as a writer or an artist or anything, that where I'm going to be able to say, my office is here, this is where I go, nobody's allowed to call me, nobody's allowed to talk to me, and 8 hours later I've written my 1,000 words for the day and move on. It's just never going to be me.
Yeah, I always tried to argue, especially in my master's program a few years back, that not writing can very much count as writing. And I got so much shit for that. And they used to, a lot of my peers used to do these weekend contests where every morning they'd come in, how many words did you write? And I did it once. I came in with a paragraph. Everybody else came in with pages and pages. And they're like, you only got a paragraph. I'm like, yeah, but it's a very good paragraph. How much of that is usable that you wrote? So I actually, my philosophy seems to be very much in line with yours. So I can't do the regimented version of it.
I'll concede. Here's where I think the kernel of truth that they're perhaps expanding too far is, you do need to really genuinely produce words that on a piece of paper. You do need a bit of solitude, a bit of stillness. You know what I mean? It's hard to do that while attending to 17 other stimuli. I agree with that. I'm not just sure for me personally, I'm not sure I can extrapolate it to, well, if I'm in a cabin by myself with no internet connection for a month, I'm going to walk out of that cabin with 50,000 words. Me personally, that doesn't appear to be true for me.
Yeah.
But maybe it would be. I've never tried it.
Yeah, I can't write.
And then, of course, more importantly, and more to your point, is like walking out of that cabin with 50,000 words. It's different from walking out of that cabin with 50,000 words that are going to one day appear in a book. I mean, that's a big leap. That's two different things. I can force myself tomorrow to say tomorrow's a writing day. I'm gonna come up with 1,000 words. But if a week later those 1,000 words aren't working for me, then they'll be deleted.
Yeah.
So it's more important probably that when I think I have 1,000 words, I genuinely have 1,000 words. I think it's kind of your point.
Yeah. That's the. I gotta tell you, I loved this episode, and the less I have to talk, and the less knowledgeable I seem by comparison, the bigger the success the episode is.
I know that sensation. I think I know that sensation. Like if I ask you to harken back to when there used to be these things called cocktail parties or gatherings, right? And if I'm talking to someone and I know literally nothing about their area of expertise, that's the most enjoyable to me. And yeah, I mean, I'll corner that person for an hour and a half and just avoid all social etiquette rules, because there's something thrilling about being led into something that you knew existed, but were really, in many instances, in my case, ignorant of, or just, very severely underinformed. Yeah, that to me is a thrilling thing. And it matters a little almost what the area is, as long as I'm getting I'm being educated in a way. There's something thrilling about being educated on things.
Yeah, I decided when I did this that I wanted people. I like it's an arts podcast, but I also wanted people who knew other areas, or maybe even occasionally have people who aren't artists. And I've been getting a lot of feedback via email. I think I reach out to 5 or 6 people a day to be on this. And whenever they're not an artist, they're like, "Why do you want me? Like, you're an art and culture podcast." And I'm like, "Well, really, I just want to have conversations with people who know stuff I don't."
Oh, I
And
agree.
I got that from a podcast I worked on as a grunt before the pandemic, where the host wasn't a creative writer. He was a nonfiction writer. So he would bring on people like Chuck Palahniuk, and we would do like an MFA course in 2 hours. He would just be like, "All right, what's this? What's this? What's this?
Right.
How do you deal with this?" And I'm like, "That's what I want to do when I eventually start one. I want to just talk to people, not only about their creative life, but everything else that I wouldn't think to talk about." Like when I reached out to you initially, I didn't know I was going to be talking to you about being a public defender. I went into this thing with with this idea that, oh, it's work of fiction. That's all it is. You've been thinking about this because of your life in the legal sphere. That just totally changed everything for me. In the past week, I've been just digesting all kinds of material that has almost nothing to do with the book I've been reading. And that's what I like. And that's why I think that this episode has been a success, because we were able to maybe touch upon some of these really deep subjects that I've always wanted to I want to be a part of these important discourse, especially as it concerns imprisonment and punishment over correction. I never knew how, and I love the fact that we were able to go into this, and that you know so much more than me about it, and that's important. And then I don't have to school you on anything. That's the best podcast episode that I could ever hope for, and I really appreciate you doing this, man.
Excellent, man. I appreciate it as well. It's always fun in a way,
Yeah.
as you say, to engage in this kind of intercourse over ideas or social policy, I guess. And so, thank you.
And that's my episode with Sergio De La Pava, and I'll see you guys on the next episode. Thanks. Bye.